Good afternoon, 7th grade history class. Welcome back to another video. I understand that some of you guys are having a bit of a hard time preparing for the test and feel like that the review that we went over today during Zoom was a little quick. So in this video, I'm going to go over maybe like a little different review for test number 10, which you guys should be taking today or tomorrow and turning that in as soon as possible as well. The biggest thing that you want to remember about Test 10 is it covers basically two time periods, lead up to World War I and lead up to World War II. The best way to remember the information, I think, in test number 10 is to kind of divide the information up. The way that you want to divide it up is between the different sections that we talked about. And the way that we did it in the book was we divided it up between different countries. So we'll talk a little bit about Russia, Germany, Italy, United States, and Great Britain. And so those are going to be and France, and those are going to be the major players in both World War I and World War II. And that's kind of the best way to kind of remember the histories of each one of those countries and kind of their relationship in World War I and II. So let's go ahead and get started. First, we're going to talk about Russia. The reason that we're going to talk about Russia first is because it's got one of the longest histories that we talked about in the book. It starts off with a guy named Ivan III. He becomes the first Tsar of Russia. Then we have Ivan IV, who is Ivan the Terrible. He's the one that creates serfdom and feudalism in Russia. We do have a couple good czars. Tsar, of course, is a Russian word for emperor or Caesar. Peter the Great was one of those. Peter the Great kind of wanted to westernize Russia, open it up to Western Europe, and also defeated the Swedes in what's called the Great Northern War, in which he took over the territory, which is present-day St. Petersburg, and he built the town or the city of St. Petersburg as his capital, or the Tsar's capital, and named it after himself. This is why it's called St. Petersburg. Later on, it was renamed to Petrograd, which means the city of Peter. St. Petersburg is also known as the window to the west because it is Russia's only Baltic Sea port, which allows their shipping to go to the Atlantic Ocean instead of going all the way around the Pacific or through the Arctic Ocean. Other important Russian czars are going to be Katharina the Great. We didn't talk about her much, but like Peter, she also wanted to expand Western ideas, Western culture. She was in favor of the French Enlightenment and so on. We've also talked about Tsar Alexander. Tsar Alexander I was the man who fought against Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. Tsar Alexander II was the man known as the Tsar Liberator. He is the man who frees the serfs or the peasants and allows them to become regular citizens of Russia. A couple other czars that we discussed are going to be Nicholas. Nicholas I, the father of Nicholas II, he's the one that starts the Russian parliament called the Duma. And then we also have Nicholas II. He's going to be the last czar of the Romanov dynasty, which lasted about 300 years and ended in 1917 during the Bolshevik Revolution. The man who started that Romanov dynasty was, of course, Mikhail Romanov. After Mikhail Romanov and the Romanov dynasty was taken out of power, we have something called the Provisional Government, which takes hold in Russia, and they are, of course, as well defeated by what's called the Bolsheviks, or the majority communists. The leader of the communists is a guy by the name of Vladimir Lenin. He's also going to be on your test. He's the leader of the communists, or the Bolsheviks, and they take over Russia, and he establishes the first communist state in the world called the USSR, which stands for the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics. Once Russia becomes communist and Lenin takes over, or the Bolsheviks take over, the first thing that they do is they pull Russia out of World War I. Of course, remember, Russia was involved in the beginning of World War I because they came to the aid of Serbia when Austria declared war on Serbia, sparking World War I. Remember, Austria invades Serbia, which starts World War I, and the reason that they do that is because the Austrian prince, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated by a Serbian. Russia comes to the aid of Serbia to protect them against Austria, but after about 3 years of war or so, Russia really doesn't want to be involved anymore, and this is why they pull out in 1917 with what's called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Now, along with Russia, they have a couple allies in World War One. Russia's allies in World War One are going to be England and France. England is, of course, the last bastion of democracy left in Europe, I guess, and they're also going to be the main fighting force in World War II as well. The United States is going to aid England, or the British Empire, in fighting the Germans in both World War I and World War II. So remember, in World War I, the Triple Entente, or as they're known as the good guys, the Allies, are going to be Russia, England, and France. Now they're going to be facing what's called the Triple Alliance. Another name for the Triple Alliance was called the Central Powers. That is World War I. Remember, World War I, Allies and Central Powers. The Central Powers are going to be Austria, along with Hungary, Germany, and then Italy's going to kind of switch sides. There's also going to be Bulgaria involved, and the other one is going to be the Ottoman Turks, or the Ottoman Empire, or Turkey as we know it today. The man who leads the Germans, or the Central Powers forces, is a guy by the name of Paul von Hindenburg. Paul von Hindenburg is a Prussian. Another Prussian that we talked about, the man that united Prussia and all of Germany for that matter, was Otto von Bismarck. When he united the Germanic states, they elected their new Kaiser, Kaiser Wilhelm the First, as their first king of united Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II will be the king during the First World War. In Italy, we have a similar situation. We have a conjoining of a lot of states or kingdoms under a united Italy, and the man that does this goes by the name of Victor Emmanuel II. He is the first king of united Italy. In Italy, we see the rise of fascism after World War I. The man who leads, or is the father of fascism, is a guy by the name of Benito Mussolini. And what he wants to do is he wants to restore the great power of the Roman Empire, which had dissipated at the end of the 5th century. And he wants Italy to regain its old colonial territories, Ethiopia, Northern Africa, even some of the Balkans, Greece and Albania. And these are places that he's going to invade with not a lot of success, and Hitler's going to have to come in and help him. The reason that Hitler comes in and helps them is because in World War II, Germany and Italy are both allies. The reason that they're allies is because they have similar ideologies. Nazis are fascists. The only difference between regular fascists and Nazis is Nazism is fascism that's based in hatred of the Jews, or what's called anti-Semitism. Italian fascism doesn't necessarily hate the Jews, but German fascism does. So they're both fascist countries, kind of like Spain is and Francisco Franco. They're also fascist. So those are the big three fascist countries in Europe at the time. The country that joins these two, Italy and Germany, in World War II is going to be Japan. Now, Japan is imperialistic, which means they want to spread their borders and invade other territories such as northern China and the Pacific Islands. They're led by a military leader named Hideki Tojo. He is the prime minister. And then their emperor at the time, Emperor Hirohito, is the man who kind of runs the country. He's kind of seen as this divine figure, kind of like a god. But he doesn't make the day-to-day decisions. Tojo does. So you have the Axis powers, which are going to be Germany, Italy, and Japan, versus the Allied powers. They're called allies again, just like in World War I, which is going to be Russia, France, and England. And then, of course, again, the United States will join in. In World War I, the United States doesn't join the war until 1917, just about a year before the war ends. The same thing will happen in World War II. The United States won't join World War II officially until about a year before it ends. On June 6, 1944, the United States officially enters into the war with the invasion of Normandy, which is the largest amphibious invasion in the history of the world. And it was the invasion of northern France, which at this time was under German occupation. And so the combined forces of the British, the Americans, the Canadians, and the Australians invaded northern France to defeat the Germans. This is known as Normandy, or D-Day. About a year later, we have Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, which is, I believe, May 9th. And then in August of later that year, in 1945, we have what's called VJ Day, which means Victory in Japan Day as well. Another important date is going to be December 7th, 1941. In 1941, the United States is not in the war. They are officially neutral. We are supporting the British. We are technically against the Germans, but we aren't openly fighting with anyone. On December 7th, 1941, Japan, who's the ally of Germany and Italy, attacks the United States and one of our territories in Hawaii called Pearl Harbor. 3 days later, Germany also declares war on the United States as a result of this because Japan is their ally, and thus the United States is thrust into the war. This is why we were pushed into World War II. The reason that we were pushed into World War I was two reasons. The first reason being was there was a guy named Arthur Zimmerman, who was a German foreign minister, who sent a letter to the government of Mexico asking them to join the war against the United States and on Germany's side, and if they win, that the Germans will give the American Southwest back to Mexico. Of course, this letter is intercepted by the British and handed over to the United States. This makes us very, very angry. Another incident is the incident of the Lusitania. Kind of like the USS Maine in the Spanish-American War, the Lusitania is a British luxury liner. It transports people mostly, but some weapons too, and it's going from New York to England. As it's crossing the Atlantic, it's sunk by German U-boats. And this ends up killing almost 130 Americans. And so this becomes another reason that the United States joins the war on the British side. And so on June 6, 1944, the United States, along with the British, the Canadians, and Australians, launched the D-Day invasion. Now, up until this point, we had been helping the British through what's called the Lend-Lease Act, which is basically an act passed by Congress that allowed us to let Britain borrow money, and then if they win the war, they were going to pay us back. One man that was against the war, or wanted the United States to stay out of it, was a guy by the name of Charles Lindbergh. You know Charles Lindbergh is the first man to fly the non-stop transatlantic flight from New York to Paris. As Germany invades the Soviet Union, we actually start supporting communist Russia at this time as well, because we also want them to defeat the Germans. And so we, along with the British, we also extend Lend-Lease to the Russians as well. Now, the Russians, of course, at this time are Soviets again. They follow Vladimir Lenin in World War I. By this time, they have a new leader, and his name is Joseph Stalin. And of course, he adopts the ideas, the same as Lenin, of communism. Communism was created by a guy named Karl Marx in 1848 through a book called The Communist Manifesto, and which basically calls for the working people, the middle class, or the working people to rise up against the middle class and the wealthy class and take over. The working people in communist societies are called the proletariat, while the middle class is called the bourgeoisie. And basically what they want is they want a violent revolution, an overthrow of the existing government, and a rise of the proletariat as the leaders of society. Now, even though Germany invaded the Soviet Union before it did that, they actually kind of tried to trick them by signing a peace treaty with them, or a non-aggression pact. Stalin and Hitler signed a non-aggression pact between each other called the Nazi-Soviet Pact, in which basically they promised not to invade each other, but of course Hitler betrays Stalin and invades Russia anyway. Of course, this is going to blow up in his face later on. Now, he only does this after he already defeated France. Now, even though he defeats France, there's still a couple people that are left in France that are still fighting or keeping the fight going. One of these guys, his name is Charles de Gaulle. He is the leader of the Free French forces. Now, let's talk about the United States. Now, the United States is led by, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II, but it's led by Woodrow Wilson in World War I. Again, like in World War I and World War II, we support the British and the French. We kind of look to them as our allies throughout history. They are culturally the same as us. They speak the same language for the most part. And so we kind of feel most closely related to the Anglo-Saxons of England or Great Britain. Now, a couple military leaders for the United States. The man who led that D-Day invasion that I was just talking about was a guy by the name of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who will eventually become the president after the war. A man who led the Pacific forces, or the American forces fighting the Japanese, it was Douglas MacArthur. The man who led the British forces was Bernard Montgomery. And the man who led the Nazi forces in Africa was Erwin Rommel. Germany tries to, once they're losing at Normandy, they try to launch their last great offensive and try to push back the Allies. This is known as the Battle of the Bulge, which happens in an Argonne forest in northern Belgium. And of course the Germans lose, and from this point forward they are on the retreat. So a couple important dates to remember for the test. You got 1914 when World War I starts. 1918 was when it ends. 1939 when World War II starts. 1945 is when it ends. United States joins in, like I said, 1 year before both of the wars end. So 1917, 1 year before it ends, and 1944, 1 year before World War II ends. Again, D-Day was 1944. Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941. Let's see. Of course, you guys know what the Holocaust is, was the Nazi attempt to annihilate the Jews. And some important men that I discussed. You have Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Stalin and Lenin in Russia, Roosevelt and Wilson in the United States. Of course, we know who Lindbergh is. Winston Churchill leads the British. Victor Emmanuel, the Italian king. Otto von Bismarck, united Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm, the king of Germany. Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French forces. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the man assassinated. Peter the Great, Michael Romanov, those are famous Russian czars. And lastly, I'm going to leave you with a couple important battles. The most important battle in the Pacific was the Battle of the Midway, which is known as the turning point of the war. After Midway, the United States is winning the war. And of course, we have the Battle of the Coral Sea, in which aircraft carriers fight each other, and the ships actually never saw each other. They're fighting with airplanes. So I hope this review kind of helps you out prepare for the test a little bit more. I know it's very lengthy and long. It's about 18 minutes or so. So as long as you hang in there, I pretty much went over everything on there. Just pay attention closely. If you need a little bit more time, you guys have till tomorrow to turn it in. I want to wish all of you guys good luck. Make sure that you're ready and prepared before you start it. And make sure that you're keeping yourself fair and honest and free from cheating. Hope you guys are staying safe and healthy, and I hope you guys have a great day. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.